story recapped here. Today I'm gonna explain a horror and sci-fi film called Forbidden World. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. Inside a spacecraft, a robot pilot called Sam 104 approaches an unconscious Mike Colby, who is inside a hibernation glass chamber. Then, when Mike wakes up and asks where they are, the robot informs him that they're in Beta Zone X Quarter. Sam 104 also adds there's a pack of food raiders on their tail, but Mike can't concentrate and says his hands are numb. Moments later, Mike helps Sam 104 destroy the spacecrafts of the raiders pursuing them. However, the lights suddenly go out, so they immediately turn them back on. Then, they eventually find the raiders' mothership, and they decide to use their fusion bolts to destroy it. After that, Sam 104 tells Mike they have orders from the Federation to go to planet Xarbia, where they're supposed to deal with the accident in a high-security lab. They then prepare for hyperspace, and even though Mike is disappointed he's not going home yet, there's nothing he can do but comply. Once they reach the facility on Xarbia, they are immediately greeted by Dr. Gordon Hauser, the head of research, and his assistant, Dr. Barbara Glasser, an expert in genetic synthesis. Then, Mike turns off the robot and leaves it before going with Gordon and Barbara, learning that the scientists are working on a bacteria that's unique to that planet. At the same time, the scientists are in the facility because they can take experimental risks there in isolation, which would be unthinkable back home. As Gordon is about to tell Mike about the accident, Mike bumps into a crew member named Tracy Baxter. Then, Gordon instructs Tracy to find Jimmy before finally heading to the lab with Barbara and Mike. There, Mike finds rabbit carcasses all over the place, and he also meets the chief of bacteriology, Cal Tinbergen. Seconds later, Gordon informs Mike that an experiment called Subject 20 got loose, and Cal adds they've created a little monster. They then show Mike the monster inside the incubator, pointing out that it's a metamorphic mutation. Cal says it's like an ordinary mutant in that it's genetically different from its parent, and he also mentions that it keeps on mutating and is totally unpredictable. Because of the mess that Subject 20 made, Mike suggests dropping a few cc's of hydrocyanic acid inside the incubator. However, Gordon thinks he's making a mistake, saying termination is not a solution. Meanwhile, Barbara asks Mike to give them a chance to fill him in and wait one night. After that, Jimmy shows up with Tracy as Mike and the scientists leave the lab, so Gordon instructs Jimmy to clean the place, also reminding him to call them if Subject 20 does anything funny. Then, Jimmy calls his colleague Earl and instructs him to tell Gordon to give him a call because Subject 20 is waking up. Curious, Jimmy opens the incubator and examines Subject 20. However, he gets startled when Gordon calls and forgets to close the incubator. Jimmy informs the scientist that Subject 20 is moving around, adding that it's acting strange. But despite that, Gordon tells Jimmy not to worry, saying one of them will come down there. Then, Gordon orders Tracy to go to the lab and make sure everything's okay. Meanwhile, Subject 20 finally comes out of its cocoon. Jimmy can't help but closely observe the little creature, but when he's about to close the incubator, it suddenly jumps on his face. Terrified, Jimmy thrashes around and tries to get rid of it, but Subject 20 violently kills him. On the other hand, everyone inside the control room fails to notice what's happening in the lab. They just quietly sit there, enjoying their dinner, and Cal continues to smoke even though he's always coughing. Then, Mike asks what Subject 20 has to do with the work on the food crisis. So another crew member, Brian, replies it's a genetic mutant. Brian states it's a proto-B binding all the other experiments, but Subject 20 got out of hand. Since Mike doesn't know what proto-B is, Gordon says proto-B is a local bacteria. Then, Gordon instructs Earl to punch up the file 7063, which explains how proto-B gets its energy from light, available chemicals, and most efficiently by consuming its own dead. Proto-B lives in a perfectly balanced closed system, where there's no predator and prey. Unfortunately, everything changed when the scientists arrived on that planet. At the same time, Cal adds that proto-B reproduces at an unbelievable rate. He says they spliced it into algae and got a foodstuff that grows so fast. To explain things better, Gordon states that all their work there involves splicing proto-B genes with the genes of other organisms. Still confused, Mike wants to clarify if Subject 20 is the result of genetic splicing between a proto-B bacteria and another organism, wondering if the other organism was an animal. However, Gordon refuses to answer his question, so Barbara starts talking about their colleague who died, Annie. Unfortunately, their conversation is cut short when they suddenly hear an alarm. Once they get to the lab, the doctors immediately tend to Jimmy while the others search for Subject 20. Cal then checks Jimmy's condition, saying he's still alive but brain dead. After that, Cal leaves with Jimmy to place him in a different room, coughing as he pushes the guy's body down the hall. Upon reaching the med room, Cal briefly leaves Jimmy to find his kit, unaware that something's happening to his colleague's body. On the other hand, the men struggle to find Subject 20 and eventually stop the search. Then, Barbara invites Mike to her room and sleeps with him, unaware that Earl is watching them from the control room. Moments later, Earl hears another alarm and quickly arms himself to see what's going on. Then, he takes Annie's necklace from her locker and puts it in his own before continuing his search for Subject 20. Unfortunately, it isn't long before Subject 20 attacks Earl in a dark corridor, where he fails to defend himself. Meanwhile, Cal injects himself with medicine as he watches Jimmy's body turn into gelatin. The next day, Tracy heads to the sauna and removes her clothes, not realizing she might be in danger. Then, Mike shows up and apologizes for disturbing her, saying he just wants to see who's down there. Mike also warns her not to wander around since Subject 20 is on the loose, so Tracy thanks him for the heads up and invites him to take a steam bath. At the same time, Tracy can't help but kiss Mike before listening to his stories about how he got his scars. However, they get interrupted when Subject 20 suddenly falls down from the ceiling and tries to attack Tracy. Thankfully, Mike quickly shoots the creature to stop it from coming after them as they flee. Then, Gordon shows up with Barbara and Brian, and the doctor still refuses to tell Mike what the monster is made of. Unfortunately, as they argue about how they should deal with Subject 20, the creature starts escaping through the skylight. So Mike instructs Brian to take Sam 104 to the decompression chamber, saying they can use the robot to find the monster. Then, Mike orders Tracy to go to the control room and track them using the outside scanner. Lastly, Mike asks Barbara to find Cal and work on Jimmy to find everything she can about a metamorph. At the same time, Mike wonders where Earl is, so Barbara says he's probably manning his monitors. Moments later, Barbara finds Cal and the gelatinous pile that used to be Jimmy's body. Meanwhile, the men put on their protective suits as they prepare to search for the monster. Gordon also informs him that they only have an hour before the atmosphere outside causes the nitrogen in their blood to get all foamy, which will lead to euphoria. After that, they eventually leave the facility and look for Subject 20. In the med room, Cal shows Barbara the analysis of the gelatinous tissue. Then, they get distracted when they witness it divide into two, and Cal can't help but be excited as he concludes that it's reproducing. The two doctors also think that its sole function is to grow and reproduce, which is why it kept Jimmy alive. Jimmy's tissue has been going through a radical metamorphosis, and ever since his attack, all his specialized cells have been changing. Then, everything stopped once all the cells in his body were identical. Concurrently, Tracy closely watches the men as they search for Subject 20 outside. Then, Brian finds Earl's body, and Gordon and Mike discover that the creature has made another cocoon. Then, Mike orders Brian and Sam 104 to shoot at the cocoon, ignoring Gordon's protests. Unfortunately, they soon realize that the cocoon is empty. Meanwhile, Gordon quickly runs to the research center. Inside, the gelatinous pile continues to change. Then, Gordon and the others eventually find Subject 20, and they fail to kill it as it returns to the facility through a vent. However, the creature suddenly attacks Gordon and drags him down the vent, so Brian tells Tracy to find out where that vent leads. With no time to waste, Tracy informs Brian of the route number, and Brian quickly realizes that it's the control room. Unfortunately, Tracy can only scream as Subject 20 comes after her, so she immediately runs to the med room and tells Barbara and Cal what happened. They then head to the lab as the others return, and that's when they realize that the creature has destroyed their computers. Because of that, Cal deduces that Subject 20 is an intelligent creature. He says even though the monster destroyed all their contact with the outside world, it still made sure to leave them with air to breathe, food to eat, and a temperature they could live in. Cal points out that the monster wants to keep them alive, adding that it wants to use them for some reason. Meanwhile, Barbara suggests communicating with Subject 20, but Mike thinks that's a bad idea. On the other hand, Brian notices that the creature is in the med room. They watch as Subject 20 eats the gelatinous pile, making Cal realize that it wants to reduce reduce them to a simple protein so we can use them as food. As if that isn't bad news enough, Cal says the creature is working on a permanent food supply, like it's planting a garden and they're the seeds. At the same time, Cal states that Subject 20 is genetically altering the bodies of its victims by injecting them with Proto-B in its saliva, which will reconstruct the bodies to suit its needs. As Cal continues to explain, an injured and deformed Gordon suddenly shows up and asks for help, scaring Tracy, so Cal immediately tends to his needs, and he finally reveals that a metamorph is a genetic fusion of a Proto-B cell and a human being. He says they spliced the genetic structure of Proto-B to the genes of Gordon's cells and used Gordon's altered cell to fertilize Annie's egg. Then, they surgically re-implanted the egg into Annie's uterus, but she died after 2 weeks. Later on, Barbara takes a shower with Tracy and tells her they should communicate with Subject 20. Barbara is confident that intelligent beings can communicate even without a language, but Tracy thinks it's too risky. At the same time, Barbara doesn't want Tracy to tell the others about their plan because she's afraid of how they'll react. Meanwhile, the men think of ways to kill Subject 20. Unfortunately, they're unaware that Barbara and Tracy are already in the med room to communicate with a monster. Then, Barbara tries to communicate with the creature, asking it to give her a sign or gesture to show that it can understand her. Barbara also attempts to talk to Subject 20 through a computer, and to her surprise, it answers. However, it has no intention of coexisting with them, and it eventually kills Barbara using its tentacle. With Barbara gone, Tracy immediately informs Mike of the situation, so Mike and Brian arm themselves and head to where Barbara is, intending to kill the monster. On the other hand, Cal studies the gelatinous tissue from Gordon's body, but he gets distracted when Sam 104 asks him how long he's had hepatocellular carcinoma. However, Cal refuses to answer and turns off the robot instead before injecting the gelatinous tissue with his cells. Concurrently, Subject 20 hides inside its cocoon again, but Brian stops Mike from shooting it because that'll cause more damage to their computers, so they look for a way to wire for outside help. Then, Cal destroys the monster's food supply in the med room before joining the others with Sam 104. Unfortunately, a liquid suddenly gushes out of the cocoon, causing Brian to be electrocuted. Then, Cal tries to kill the creature despite Mike's protests, only to be knocked down by one of the monster's tentacles. With no other choice, Mike carries Cal and heads to the genetics lab with Tracy and Sam 104. On their way there, Mike instructs Tracy to get the morphine in his room. Cal then tells Mike that his disease could kill the mutant, adding that he thought he could end the monster by making it swallow his infected tissue. Desperate and dying, Cal asks Mike to cut out the lump of tissue in his abdomen and feed it to the creature, and he doesn't even want to wait for Tracy for the morphine. With their time running out, a reluctant Mike follows Cal's instructions and performs the surgery without morphine. Meanwhile, Subject 20 chases Tracy as she heads to the genetics lab. Then, Tracy soon reaches the lab and gives Cal the morphine, and Mike eventually gets the lump out of the doctor's abdomen. Unfortunately, it isn't long before Cal dies, but they don't even have time to grieve because the monster breaks into the lab, so Sam 104 repeatedly shoots the creature, while on the other hand, Mike bravely tries to feed the lump to it. However, Subject 20 hits Mike with its tentacle, leaving Tracy even more frightened. Refusing to give up, Sam 104 takes a scalpel and stabs Subject 20 in the eye, but the monster only gets angry and strikes the robot with its tentacle. Due to that, Sam 104 ends up being destroyed and broken into pieces. Enraged, Mike comes at Subject 20 and finally manages to feed the lump to it, causing it to throw up and slowly die. Sadly, even though the monster is already dead, Mike and Tracy can't help but think about their colleagues who lost their lives.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.